the night of February 28 was calm. Only from time to time missile flares were seen on the front line and strolling duty machine guns clattered. Aviation did not work. It was sowing fine snow. Through the torn clouds running across the sky glimpsed a dim disk of the moon. In the location of the headquarters of the division reigned animation, slammed the doors of dugouts. Now and then departed cavalrymen, Vestovi echoed, hurried on business messengers. The unfamiliar faces of soldiers and officers glimmered, and strange voices were heard. In the morning came an order from the army headquarters. The division was withdrawn to the reserve. In the afternoon came representatives of the replacements, then the commanders of units and subdivisions of the 194th Infantry Division. For several hours with our help they studied the front line, fire system, engineering structures of the enemy, got acquainted with intelligence behavior of the Germans. They drew maps and schemes of our defense system. In the first half of the night began to move units and parts. Our infantrymen, mortarmen, artillerymen, sappers went to the rear and their places in rifle cells, on machine gun platforms, mortar and artillery positions, in trenches and dugouts were occupied by people who by rank and position they were in a spacious, two-roofed headquarters dugout, with a red-hot iron stove in the middle. The telephones were crackling. The load on the communication lines was double. Officers were settling unforeseen questions, which in such cases always turns out to be a lot. Above the marching tables of the chiefs of services, smoke. Officers of the staff tell shift officers about the peculiarities of the defense, the behavior of the enemy, draw up documents, map the situation, and almost all of them smoke. It can't be helped, it's a frontline habit. Smoky. Colonel Danielovsky went into the room. It's like hanging up an axe. Everyone stood up. Sit down. Fyodor Semyonovich waved his hand. Go on working. Fyodor Semyonovich Danielovsky returned to the division at the beginning of the month. We were sincerely happy about it. We worked with him and, as they say, understood him half-heartedly. Lieutenant Colonel Abashev, Chief of Staff, returned with him. The departure of the commander, and then the Chief of Staff, in the midst of the battles, to some extent affected our work. Other people came to the leadership of the division. The requirements became different. Naturally, the restructuring of our work affected regiments, battalions, other links of the divisional mechanism and caused a certain reaction, talk. Now, in the words of Pyotr Vasilievich Rumyantsev, everything is in its place. Comrade Colonel, Massey came to Danilovsky Intelligence Chief Major Korotayev, the Combat Guard reports. The Germans behave calmly. The regiments have changed. Will you allow my guys to give up their positions? Yes. Valentin Ivanovich changed scouts and take them to the rear. Scenes took place in an organized manner. The enemy didn't show any concern. Apparently, he didn't notice anything. In the morning, the units met on the march. The division followed the route. Zaivanyevo, Eleni Kapustevich, Zakodi, a small railroad station Vasilevichi. So formation has thinned. Knee passing the column of the regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Abashev could not stand it. Oh, how thinned out. We were passed by units of the 828th Rifle Regiment, in battalion columns of 70 to 90 men, no more, in machine gun and anti-tank gun crews, one each, in mortar and artillery columns, 2 or 3 men each. The soldiers walked with a tired step, indifferently looking ahead or at their feet. On a mule horse near us stopped the regiment commander. Nikolai Viktorovich, how many active bayonets in the line? Reach the 140. Lieutenant Colonel Krasovsky took off his hat, wiped his shaved head with a handkerchief, sighed heavily. Dubrava and Pritikar were not easy for us. We lost a lot of people, and what kind of people? Experienced, real fighters. The car with the division commander, the head of the political department, approached, and after it rolled up a trophy bus with the chiefs of services. The officers got out of the cars. The staff is assembled, said Peter Grigorievich Zavago. Shall we begin, Fyodor Semyonovich? Danilovsky nodded in agreement. Neki comrades, Zavago's voice sounded excited. The order has been received. On March 2, loading into echelons. The destination station is Nizhyn. We're leaving for additional staffing, rest and training. Peter Grigorievich was silent, looked after the column of Sapper battalion moving away from us, and continued. We withstood a difficult test with you. Remember Uneka, the bridgehead on the right bank of the Soch, Dubrava, Pritika, dozens of other places where we had to fight the enemy. Everywhere the soldiers and commanders showed bravery. With excitement we listened to the political commander. Indeed, in the most difficult conditions we had to fight. Not by chance the division was dubbed swampy, impenetrable. At night we will long be haunted by disturbing dreams, forcing of many rivers and rivulets, swamps, horses, equipment, people falling into the mire, starting from 40 packs and ending with provisions. The soldiers carried everything on their backs, dirty, ragged, tired, but invincible. The head of the political department of the division told us about the feat of the personnel of Tasmikin and Lyagnev companies near Barakov. Having broken forward, the units together with their supporting 45mm guns were surrounded. One after another enemy attacks followed. Our fighters held back the onslaught of the enemy, exterminated the German infantry, destroyed his firepower, burned tanks and armoured personnel carriers. Fascists, not counting losses, climbed on a breakthrough. At noon, the companies withstood a frantic attack of the reinforced battalion. The enemy rolled back with heavy losses. There was a respite, but it did not last long. Hitlerites again made an artillery and mortar strike on the positions of the companies, then went on the attack. Ammunition was running out, and the artillerymen had already run out of it. It was decided to go for a breakthrough. Having let the enemy near, the infantrymen threw grenades at him and rushed forward. A hand-to-hand fight ensued. With bayonet butt, shovel our soldiers were making their way. Several Hitlerites rushed at Private Diverk. With the butt of his carbine, the artilleryman stunned one. Then the stock of the rifle butt shattered into splinters from the queue of a fascist machine gun. What to do? His gaze fell on a German grenade with a long handle lying nearby. Diverk picked it up and threw it. The Nazis flinched to the sides, fell. This time was enough for the soldier to snatch a machine gun from the hands of the killed Hitlerite. With the exclamation, "Take that, you bastards," he began to shoot the enemies who surrounded him. But no matter how hard our soldiers tried, the forces were unequal. Most of the brave men died. Their courage and fortitude were told about by Petty Officer Kornilov, Senior Sergeant Kodikov, Private Melchikov, who broke through the enemy's ring. Lieutenant Colonel Zhivago coughed, and in a deaf voice concluded, "Every feat of soldiers and commanders we must bring to the survivors. Do not forget to say thank you to the soldier. He deserves it, our soldier. He bore everything and did his best." Vasilevich met us with black openings of windows of half-burned houses, piles of mangled, no longer needed military equipment. Only a few days ago there had been fighting here. On March 2, loading into echelons began. The first to leave was the 862nd Infantry Regiment. The division command together with the communication company and sapper battalion were loaded into the second train. The next day were sent artillery, 889th and 828th Rifle Regiments and the rest of the units. After sleepless nights at the front, one sleeps sweetly on the wagon bunks. The hay purchased by caring households from the forester near Vasilevich smells fragrant. The dry grass smells something familiar and close. And if it were not for the measured shaking of the Teplish car and steam locomotive horns, you would think that you were at home, in the hayloft where you spent so many nights during the years of childhood and youth. The echelon stands for a long time at stations and semi-stations. Green Street to the trains going to the front, trains with red crosses on the cars. Our turn is the last. That's really a sleepy kingdom. Major Rumiantsev waves towards the Teplashki at one of the stops. Joe Vasilievich was checking the service of anti-aircraft gunners, guard and internal troops. They fell down like bears in their dens. Continues the major, snoring. Are you with them? Hearing my surname, I rise up, saying the first thing that came to mind. Like everyone else, so am I. I see. I'd like to squeeze in about 600 minutes myself, but service is service. I've got something to talk to you about. Get down. I crawl down from the bunk, scoop water with a cauldron and pour it on the hot back of my head. You'll catch cold. The water must be ice cold. No, I'm used to it. A Siberian. And the water's room temperature. Chief of the operational department waits for me to put on my uniform, and only then invites me to sit down. I lower myself on a pine stump. Pyotr Vasilievich smokes a cigarette, as if in between he says, "You've suited us, Sasha. You have a staff grip. You've acquired some skill. What's your point, Comrade Major?" How impatient. Yes, I understand you. I knew from your voice that you won't stay. And after a little silence, Rumiantsev continued, The other day we'll call you personnel officer. He has already talked to me. I won't interfere with your departure. You're not going to the rear, but to the front line. That's right. Major Rumyantsev took a puff of smoke, sighed, waved his hand through the half-smoked cigarette into the door of the blazing hot bourgeoiska. Got it. Now I'm going to take a nap. What a piece of news. I didn't ask Pyotr Vasilievich any questions, though I wanted to know where he would be sent. But is it tactful to ask? And I didn't dare. See, the carriage jerked and rolled along the rails. Someone's loud voice was hurrying the stragglers. The green light of a semaphore flashed in the square of a tiny window. The train was leaving the front line. The stove was humming in the teplishka. The watchman, a low, stubby fighter of about 50 years of age, threw wood into the fire soaked with warmth, quacked contentedly and blissfully squinted his sparse red eyebrows. The staff officers were tossing and turning in their sleep. Sometimes one of them would jump up, stare at the fire for a while and fall back on the haystack. The morning greeted us with sunshine. I pushed aside the door of the teploshka and involuntarily squeezed my eyes shut. Damp, thickly smelling air hit me in the face. Large drops of water fell abundantly from the roof of the car. An icicle broke and shattered into dozens of multicolored sparkling shards. The command training, as Lieutenant Colonel Abashev called it, took place in a neighboring car. By the time we arrived, a map of the Dubrava area, erased at the bends, was already hanging on the wall. Swamps again. Captain Gerasimov couldn't stand it. I've already got them in my liver for the rest of my life. Why remember? But then the division leadership came in. The debriefing began. Colonel Danilovsky evaluated the decisions of commanders and chiefs, analyzed the security measures, praised the scouts of the 889th Rifle Regiment for the initiative in the capture of Dubrava. In the address of the Divisional Intelligence Company, said that the eyes and ears of the division did not always keep the headquarters informed of events, sometimes acted slowly and indecisively, broke away from the enemy. Major Valentin Korotev and other service chiefs more than once had to blush during the speech of the division commander. I was especially alarmed by the fact, Danilovsky chuckled, that not all reports on the situation corresponded to the real state of affairs. Some comrades sometimes sinned against the truth, for one reason or another gave wishful thinking for reality, and this should not be allowed in any case. In fact, this is disinformation of higher commanders. Of course, to tell the truth, no matter how bitter it may be, it also requires courage, as well as to rise to the attack. The division commander was referring to the case of the Chief of Staff of the 828th Rifle Regiment. During the battle for Dubrava, the regiment tripped on a water-filled drainage ditch, not very wide, but located in the open space and shot by the enemy. This obstacle spoiled a lot of nerves. For several hours there was a battle for it. The Corps headquarters was in a hurry to take the village, and the damn ditch slowed down the whole thing. We, of course, pressed on the regiment commander Krasovsky, and finally the report. We passed the ditch. Chief of Staff of the division quite rubbed his hands. Finally, be damned. Rumyantsev joined the 889th Regiment, and suddenly his face stretched. It turns out that the left flank battalion of the regiment lies in front of the ditch. This was reported by the Chief of Staff Modin, a man whose words there is no reason not to believe. Angry Abashev snatched the tube from the hands of the major. What are you tramping there, behind the ditch, and the Germans are not? Krasovsky kicked them out long ago. The Krasovsky is behind us, on the flank. Are you sure? Yes, Comrade 2. Good. Now an officer of the headquarters will come to you. We'll sort it out on the spot. As it turned out, Major Zabaznov, Chief of Staff of the 828th Regiment, was to blame. Several men from Laptev's company overcame the ditch. Combat reported this to the regimental headquarters, and Alexei Prokhorovich Zabaznov, reporting to us, added on his own behalf that the regiment was fixed on the line. While the calls were going on, the fascists managed to push back a handful of our fighters to the former position by counterattack. However, the commander was in no hurry to report what had happened. It is difficult to say what he was guided. One thing was clear: committed negligence bordering on a crime. During the battle can happen anything. It happens that it does not go exactly as outlined on the maps and laid out in the plans. But this does not give the right to the commander, no matter what post he holds, not one iota, to depart from the truth. Embellishment, untimely report on the state of affairs are always harmful, but especially fraught with grave consequences and intolerable in a combat situation. where even the slightest deviation from the truth or a minute or two of delay can turn into extra human lives. This is what the division commander warned us against. Analysis of the battles for Dubrava, and then Pritika gave a lot to everyone, and especially to us young officers. It made us look at ourselves from the outside, analyze our work and the work of comrades, lower commanders, staffs, neighbours. For me, it was a great school of commanders' formation and gaining combat experience. One day I was asked to look in by the head of the personnel department. Mikhail Petrovich Taranov greeted me cordially, joked about the March drop and the coming spring. Leafing through a thin folder of my personal file, he said with a smile, "Your staff service is over, Altunin. It's over. You're going to be a commander. Aren't you glad? I can see from your face that you're happy, and rightly so. At your age and with your hot temper, you shouldn't be souring in HQ." Captain Taranov didn't ask for my consent. He spoke of my new assignment as if it was a done deal. It was not difficult to guess that Mikhail Petrovich had time to meet Major Rumiantsev, and they decided, at least for the short term, my fate. I had to introduce myself to my superiors. The division commander is waiting for us. The wagon was divided in two by soldiers' cloak tents. One half housed the personnel department, in the other half, the division commander, the head of the political department, and the chief of staff. We went in there. The room was neatly cleaned. At a table covered with red cloth, Colonel Danilovsky was writing something. On the walls there were beds with white pillowcases on the pillows made up with soldiers' blankets. "Mission to come in, Comrade Colonel." "Yes, come in." Danilovsky lifted his face from the sheet of paper, written in small handwriting, looked at us, and, fixing his gaze on me, "Altunin is here, so you're running away from headquarters. Not good. And already to both of us. Comrade, sit down." Fyodor Semyonovich looked at me once more and continued. "We'll have a short conversation, Alexander Terentievich. We know you. In the battles you have shown yourself from the good side, and this is the best characteristic. There is an opinion to appoint you commander of the 2nd Battalion of the 889th Rifle Regiment. Can you handle it?" "I can do it." "I didn't expect any other answer from you. Take the battalion, get into the business, and wait for us to visit." The colonel stood up, signalling that the conversation was over. We also stood up. At that time, Lieutenant Colonel Chivot entered the room. "Yes, Grigorievich?" The commander turned to him. "You have nothing to the new commander?" "Altunin," smiled Lieutenant Colonel Zhivago. "What is there to congratulate him? He's ours, we know. The only thing I'd like to ask you, Senior Lieutenant, stay close to Yelegin. You have an experienced, knowledgeable deputy commander. It's not a bad thing to learn how to work with people from him. In general, take a good look at him. You won't regret it." "Well, then I wish you success." Mar shook my hand, Danilovsky. "And that on the new position for a long time, not to linger combat. Now we will ask you not only for yourself, but also for the people. Understand me?" "Yes, I understand." "That's right. Congratulated me on my new position and the head of the political department." I got out of the car. My heart was both happy and anxious. The train stood at the crossing, waiting for the semaphore to open the way. On March 12, the division finished unloading at Nishin Station, and on the same day left the small Ukrainian district town drowned in gardens. The headquarters went to Bezuglovka, 828th Rifle Regiment, to Kurilovka, 862nd, 889th Rifle and 261st Artillery Regiments, and 418th Separate Fighter Anti-Tank Division respectively settled in the settlements of Pashkivka, Doroginka, Sindor. The division became a part of the 3rd Guards Army. With a duffel bag over my shoulder, having easily jumped off a hitchhiker's cart on a crooked street of Doroginka, I went to look for the regiment headquarters. The gardens and orchards of the village were still covered with snow, and in the outfield there were already gaps with damp, shining in the sun last year's grass, falling almost knee-deep in the stiffened ice. I approached the first house I could find, in the wide yard of which 2 army camp kitchens were smoking. He called out to the cook, stirring a large ladle in a cauldron. "Where is the regimental headquarters, Comrade Senior Lieutenant?" asked the freckled soldier. "Evan, 5 yards away," he pointed along the alley. There was a house with a big porch under a green iron roof. It's the biggest in the district. The collective farm board, and now it's the headquarters. Full information, I smiled. "Why?" The cook didn't understand. Did I say too much? No, thank you. It's about 15 minutes later, I entered the headquarters. In a room spacious 5-walled hut, Regimental Chief of Staff Major Modin conducted with the officers of the lesson. I sat down on the free edge of a wide bench and waited for a break. Nikolai Sergeyevich, noticing me, smiled. I am listening to you. I reported my arrival. Modin listened and in response cordially said, By the way arrived. We analyzed the actions of the rifle company in the forest and swampy terrain. Sit down, listen. Maybe you'll take something for yourself, especially since Major Pavlyuk is away. There's no one to report to except Major Kulyabin, but he's not here right now. We decided to build a bathhouse, so I went there. He'll be back in an hour and a half. Sit down. Nikolai Sergeyevich continued the lesson. He spoke calmly, confidently. He reinforced the statutory provisions with examples of past battles, decisions of commanders and superiors in the course of accomplishing assigned tasks. He often referred to one or another of the officers. He did not ignore me. In short, there was a business conversation. After the class, Modin introduced me to the officers of the regiment, familiarized me with the plans for training of the unit. Half-month training of the personnel was mainly reduced to practical training but actions in various combat conditions. The exception were officers, for whom were planned theoretical lectures, tactical briefings, taking credits for statutes and manuals, seminars, and the incoming replenishment, the basis of work with which was based on the study of the material part of the weapon and single training. Over 2/3 of the time was devoted to tactical training, the crown of which was live-fire exercises. A lot of time was devoted to combat operations in wooded and swampy terrain, forcing water obstacles, especially at night. Late in the evening, when my acquaintance with the documents was coming to an end, Majors Valentin Evstafievich Pavlyuk and Nikolai Afanasyevich Kulyabin returned. They were excited and joyful. Replenishment had still arrived in the division. It became known that the material part of the fighter anti-tank artillery was being replaced by 57 mm guns, which had proved themselves to be the best. Seeing me, Pavlyuk said quite contentedly, "You've finally shown up, you lost soul. Today I asked Rumian Svevs, 'Where do you put my commander?' 'What commander?' he said. 'What commander?' 'Altunin. He hasn't been confirmed in his post yet.' 'Well, what of it? The order is a piece of paper, but I need a man, a combatant. People are waiting for him, living people. 'Yes, do not boil you.' Answers. 'Your Altunin is gone. Yesterday evening he left, and probably already in place.' Nikolai Sergeyevich, Pavlyuk turned to the Chief of Staff. 'Have you introduced Altunin to our affairs?' 'Yes, I introduced him. I introduced him to the officers of the regiment.' 'That's good. Have you been to the battalion?' 'Not yet.' 'We'll go together. Nikolai Afanasyevich, won't you keep us company?' 'Of course I will. I need to talk to Yeligin. He's got no party organization in the 4th Company, and the political department is pushing him. Or rather, recommends it. Nikolai Afanasyevich.' 'Let it be so.' 20 minutes later, we entered the battalion headquarters, a small but cozy hut under a hewn roof. Here they were waiting for us. A captain of medium height, thin, with a black mustache, about 40 years old, gave a command. 'At ease.' Pavlyuk stopped him and nodded in my direction. 'The new battalion commander has arrived. You have already been introduced to him. I just want to add that he is a frontline soldier. Please love and complain.' Valentin Evstafievich took me under his arm and introduced the captain. 'Bakarin Nikolai Yakovlevich, your deputy in formation, Alexander Terentievich.' We shook hands firmly. Adjutant Senior Battalion Captain Okremenko, he introduced another officer, clearly taking under the Lieutenant Yeligin, the deputy commander of the political part. Me stood up at the command attention, a dense man. Ivanovich added, standing next to Major Kulyabin. They sat down at a large washed-to-yellow peasant table. The regiment commander asked about the progress of classes in the battalion, preparation for platoon tactical exercises with live firing. Captain Bukharin leisurely began to report. Everyone listened to him attentively. The case touched on developments. Adjutant Senior presented several options. 'Not bad. Familiarized with them?' said Pavlyuk and passed to me. 'What is your opinion?' 'The developments were mostly done well, except that the situation needs to be complicated at certain stages.' 'That's what I mean.' Pavlyuk smiled. 'Only not a little, but to the limit. Make commanders and fighters to work with full commitment and even more. In training should follow Suvorov's formula: hard in training, easy in battle. Better sweat than excessive blood, you inserted Kolyabin. We discussed the upcoming tactical and formation training, firing. We talked about personnel. In the coming days, the rank and file will fully get, assured Major Pavlyuk, understaffing sergeants to solve at the expense of experienced and distinguished in-combat fighters. Training companies suffered heavy losses, and do not count on it. You're staffed with officers. There is no battalion partorg, sighed Lieutenant Yeligin. Didn't you pick him up? Major Kolyabin looked at him. How many communists there are in the battalion, and here you are? No, so they didn't pick them up if I'm asking them to. Officers are mostly of Komsomol age. Among petty officers and sergeants, there are some with life experience but not enough literacy. Well, Ivan Arvich, you'll get a ready-made partorg. Is there really no one? Nikolai Afanasyevich, there was more than one, but you know the last battles, and the communists were ahead of us. Oh, right. Kolyabin was silent. We'll find you a party leader. We talked about creating a party organization in the 4th Company, and this issue was resolved positively. Pavlyuk and Kolyabin left. A talkative hostess in her 50s set the table. It's a sin not to eat Nijinsky cucumbers, she began in Ukrainian. Our region is famous for them all over Russia. Sit down and eat. I've prepared some bouillon and lard. Thank God the Germans rarely visited us. They didn't loot us like in other places. I didn't want to upset the landlady, and, admittedly, I hadn't tasted home food for a long time. Everything was from a soldier's cauldron, or even only canned food. I sat down, invited the orderly to the table. With pleasure they ate boiled potatoes with crispy cucumbers, lard and freshly baked homemade bread, the smell of which, when they entered the house, even took their breath away. Train was late, and I had to get up early the next day, so I decided to go to bed. Despite a busy day, I could not fall asleep for a long time. I was disturbed by the rush of affairs and worries. I didn't want, as they say, to face the mud. At dawn we were on our feet. The village street met us with silence. Stove stacks threw curly jets of white smoke into the blue sky. Cocks crowed belatedly. A dog barked fiercely in the neighbouring yard. All of this smelled familiar, but already forgotten. My heart beat joyfully. Peaceful life, fatherly home, how little we appreciate you in our youth. Soldiers ran out of the white Ukrainian huts. Some with buckets ran to the well, others rubbed themselves with snow. They shouted, joked, laughed. Here and there were heard imperious voices. Commanders were hurrying their subordinates. Mizatoon, line up. Came the command. Dozens of boots clattered on the road ice, formed overnight. A kettle dropped by someone rang. An explosion of laughter and voices was heard. A new day had begun, with its difficulties and worries, joys and sorrows, a day of frontline life. The impression of the battalion's cantonment was not bad. The units were placed in peasant yards. After trenches and trenches with groundwater, Belarusian bogs, frosts and thaws, drying shoes and clothes, it was a paradise. People looked cheerful. The premises were kept in order. The service of the troops was not badly organized. I was pleased that the subordinates knew what they were going to do. I could feel the firm hand of the headquarters officers of the battalion. My deputies turned out to be knowledgeable people. Captain Nikolai Yakovlevich Bukharin, a man with extensive military and life experience, worked hard, set the tone for the commanders of companies and platoons in demanding, organizing and conducting classes and exercises. Despite the difference in age, Nikolai Yakovlevich was twice my age. We quickly found a common language, became good comrades and even friends. I cannot but emphasize, I learned from him the methodology of working with subordinates. I also learned a lot from my deputy in political part, Lieutenant Ilagin. Ivan Ivanovich in the past, a man of the most humane profession, a teacher. He was born on the Volga. In 1928, when I was still running as a boy, joined the party. I volunteered for the front. I was a political fighter, parter of a company, battalion, regiment agitator, through the edge of the front life, several times contused, wounded. He knew, as they say, along and across the soldier's soul. That's why the soldiers came to him for advice and help in the night and midnight. And although he repeats, they do not come to me, to the party, Ivan Ivanovich personality. His authority meant a lot in the battalion. Not without reason, he was highly appreciated and known not only in the regiment, but also in the division. Much good can be said about Captain Okremenko, other officers of the staff and units. In general, the command staff of the battalion was friendly and efficient. We were doing well. We had no complaints about the course of the training process. In the first days of my stay in the regiment, I was waiting for a pleasant surprise. Once, returning from shooting, I spurred my horse and broke away from the general column. I wanted to be alone, to gather my thoughts. The weather was favorable for it. After almost 24 hours of snowfall, the sun came out. The first drops were falling from the trees. I drove, rejoiced at the nice day, the sun, the light, the fact that today the results of shooting were much higher than the previous time. As the houses of Doroginka began, the street was packed with loose snow, scattered with numerous paths. At a turn, a fighter appeared. A soldier like a soldier, except that he wore a half-coat of unusual whiteness and a Cossack kubanka. Not many different people come to the regiment on business of service. I would have passed by without being stopped by a melodious maiden's voice. "Merci you, Sasha." It was like an electric shock. Is it really Marina? Jumping off the saddle, rushed to the girl and 2 steps away from her, as if running into an invisible barrier, stopped in indecision. Marina! In this name for me merged together and 2 years of waiting for the meeting and joy and surprise. Marina, with greedily looking into the sweet face of my saviour, selflessly defended me in March 1942 in the hospital from death. Parting, we promised to correspond, and at the first opportunity to meet, but we managed to exchange only 1 letter. The sudden advance of fascist troops in the south of the country interrupted the correspondence. The territory where the hospital was located was behind enemy lines. I received disappointing answers to all my inquiries about the fate of Nurse Marina. Immediately after the liberation of the station, Likoi made a new attempt. Reconnaissance demanded to give the address of the girl's parents, which I did not know. The commandant of the station said that during the evacuation, the fascists bombed the hospital echelons, so most likely the nurse I was interested in was killed. Only in the depth of my heart there was hope for a meeting after the war. And here was a meeting on the front road. Marina looked at me with wide-open eyes, silently. Apparently, too, did not believe in what had happened. Tears were rolling down her pale cheeks. With tenderness, I look at the almost unchanged face. Only pale cheeks, barely noticeable mesh of wrinkles in the corners of the eyes, and as if frozen in them, pain spoke about the experience. "Hello, Marina," I almost whispered. "Is it really you?" Overcoming the stiffness of the unexpected meeting and feeling a sense of tenderness, I hugged my saviour and held her tightly to my chest. How much I was looking for you, Sasha. Swallowing tears, finally squeezed out Marina, where only did not write. I too, Marina, but you're like in the water vanished. The hospital was bombed. I had to endure a lot during the retreat. Then the reserve. I asked to go to the front line, and now you've come here. So us. I finally exhaled. Yes. So now almost together. That's great, Marinushka. I command a battalion. A smile, a joyful smile, lit up her tired face. Forgetting everything, we continued to stand in the middle of the road, eagerly asking each other about our experiences during the separation. From that day, we continued to walk the same front road, firmly resolved that only death could separate us. On one of the last days of March, I conducted tactical exercises with the 4th Company. The weather was not spring. The low wind was reeling the flaps of overcoats, burning my face, carrying snow course. In the shaky shroud, vaguely viewed objects. It was as if winter had decided to give spring a fight. Hollows, gardens, and shrubbery were covered with wet snow. Class ended at dusk. Tired, we walked back to the village. We approached the outskirts of the village. It was quieter here. From the outermost huts smelled of home and warmth. The column quickened its pace. They heard talking jokes. In one of the courtyards we passed, I heard a lively conversation and laughter. Wanting to find out what was going on there, I turned to the yard. Ntsiedizo tak divo. I heard Ukrainian words. Malenki, I want to grab you with my teeth and hit you with a hoof. It turned out that a new batch of horses had been sent. Natenko, from the regimental mortar battery, chose a black stallion, came up to him, and the horse grabbed him by his overcoat. They rushed in different directions. There was a crackling sound. Natenko tumbled out of the hedge, and the colt was on his back. A circus. smiled the soldier standing next to him and explained. I saw such small skates in the circus before the war, and here they sent them to us. The soldiers continued to discuss the details of the meeting with unusual horses. The spacious peasant's yard was bursting with laughter now and then. On arrival at the headquarters, I asked Ivan Ivanovich, "What other circus horses have they brought into the regiment?" "No, Alexander Terentyevich," Lieutenant Yeligin revived. "Mongolian breed horses arrived to the regiment, stunted half-wild steps. We started to dismantle them, but they wouldn't let us. Not only to harness them, they wouldn't let themselves be caught. If anyone comes near, they throw themselves. A performance." Ivan Ivanovich smiled at something of his own. "We got a few horses too. Tomorrow you'll see them. I think we'll ride them, tame their temper, and they'll be good helpers for us." You looked like in the water, unassuming at first glance horses turned out to be very hardy. They helped us during the battles. Soldiers and commanders, especially artillerymen and anti-tankers, many times remembered the gift of Mongolian comrades with kind words. We continued to prepare for battles, rejoiced at the news from the fronts. In these days, the second stage of the grandiose battle in the right bank Ukraine unfolded. Despite the spring thaw, the troops of the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts were crushing the fascist invaders. Every day, radio and newspapers reported about the liberation of dozens of settlements. In Sovinform reports, the names of Chernivtsi, Kamyanets-Podilsky were more and more often flashed. I remember how jubilant we were when the Soviet army came to the border, and not only for us, for all Soviet people. On March 27, 1944, the newspaper Pravda wrote, expressing the aspirations of the people. Here it is, the long-awaited, thrice-desired state border of our fatherland, 33 months ago trampled by the enemy. In honor of the withdrawal of the 2nd Ukrainian Front to the Prut River, the state border of the USSR rally was held in the regiment, so I will never forget the excited faces of my comrades in arms. In Captains Ivan Vechtemov, Sergei Emelanov, Senior Lieutenants Nikolai Shugunov, Dmitry Odegov, Lieutenants Ivan Titov, Anna Shemirdanov, Senior Sergeants and soldiers, together with whom I was soon to fight with the sworn enemy, and our thoughts and aspirations were well expressed by Major Nikolai Afanasyevich Kulyabin. So the day is not far off when you and I will come into contact with the enemy. We will beat and drive the fascist scum, chase it back to where it came from. Nikolai Afanasyevich looked at us. "Noting, friends, I want to tell you one more thing. The day is not far off when we will enter the lands of the peoples of Europe. You and I will have a high and honorable mission of liberators from the fascist yoke. We must prepare for it. We will be looked up to. We, the people who came from the world of socialism, will be taken as an example. The bourgeois propaganda has made a lot of falsehoods about us. We must always remember this and represent our Soviet system abroad with dignity." In the plans of combat and political training of personnel from these days, more and more often began to meet issues related to the upcoming actions on the territory of neighboring countries. The topics of information, lectures, reports, conversations often began to be devoted to the political situation in Poland, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Romania, the peoples of which launched the anti-fascist. The commanders and political workers took materials for speeches from the periodicals. The newspapers Pravda and Izvestia, Krasnaya Zvezda and others, magazines at that time paid much attention to this issue. We realized that the stay in the reserve could end any day, and we hurried with the formation of units. The battalion held platoon and company tactical exercises with live firing, and preparations for regimental ones began. I don't remember exactly, but somewhere in the first days of April I conducted a tactical and formation training with the battalion. I was tired during the day, and the personnel couldn't feel their legs at all. It's a joke. In the unbroken mud on the hillocks and ravines, almost 24 kilometers ran. Moreover, with the deployment and numerous inputs, the frontline soldiers were still cheerful, but the young people were getting cold feet. Naturally, the look of all of us left much to be desired. The battalion column was pulling into the village street. Having spurred the horse, I hurried to the apartment. I decided to tidy up quickly. In the evening there was to be a meeting with the regiment commander. Just threw off his overcoat and went to the washstand. A messenger from the headquarters came running into the house. "Mohammed, Senior Lieutenant, the general is asking for you." "Oh, he's so angry," he yelled at the duty officer. "What's wrong? Why is he scolding you?" "I don't know." So pulling on his uniform, tucking his harness under his epaulettes, he jumped out of the gate. On a broken dirt road dividing in half a small village paddock, a car stuck splattered with mud. A group of military men stood near the car. I ran up to them and saw the general. "Are they yours?" He nodded in the direction of the battalion units beginning to disperse from the village yards. "That's right. A gypsy tabor. What a sight of soldiers and officers. In the mud, dishevelled. We're coming back from tactical training. Maposhikonsi, they've disbanded the men. They hold their weapons like sticks. It's not troops. It's a damn thing. But, what's your last name?" The general wouldn't listen to me. He turned to one of the officers. "Write it down." That was the end of my meeting with the corps commander, Major General Donskov. I do not know what mood Semyon Ivanovich was in that day, but acquaintance with him left me with an unpleasant residue, all the more so because a few days later an order arrived about my non-compliance with my position. This punishment was the first and the last for my service in the army. Rude shouting haste to make this or that decision with regard to a subordinate does not colour a commander of any rank. A person who respects people and himself will never act like that. Later military service brought me together with commanders and military leaders demanding, but tactful, able to delve into the essence of the matter and calmly make a decision on it. I warmly remember Colonel F. H. A. Bishev, General F. A. S. D. Danilovsky, Marshals of the Soviet Union R. E. Y. Malinovsky A., Beshko M.V., Zakharov and many others, demanding without insulting. That is what characterizes their work. This is how it should be. I remember that at that time I was knocked out of the usual service rut for a long time, and I was going through what happened. The bitter residue did not pass even 4 months later, when Semyon Ivanovich Donskov signed my submission for the hero of the Soviet Union, and now, many years later, it is unpleasant to remember it. Continuing combat training, we held party, komsomol and general meetings in companies, preparing for the battalion party meeting. Ivan Ivanovich Yelagin invited me to make a report at the meeting. I started to refer to busyness. "No, Alexander Terentyevich," insisted Yelagin. "You are a communist commander directing the work of the party organization. Who else but you to set the tone? Don't worry about the report, I'll help you." The meeting went well. Communists in a business-like manner talked about our successes, revealed shortcomings in the educational process, made suggestions for their elimination. At a late dinner, Ivan Ivanovich answered the question that was bothering. The report, Alexander Tentyevich, turned out well. You managed to grasp the main thing and present it in an interesting way. Now, praise Ivan Ivanovich. A lot of things didn't work out. I want to say it, but I can't express it yet. I don't think I'm praising you. I'm telling the truth, but it's good that you're not satisfied with yourself. Yelagin took a sip of tea, smiled, and offered, "The day after tomorrow we have political information for the personnel. Won't you give it? Tell us about the events in the Crimea. By the way, you fought there. These days the troops of the 4th Ukrainian Front of Army General F.I., Tobakin, the separate seaside army of Army General A.I., Eremenko sailors, Erenko sailors of the Black Sea Fleet, and the Azov flotilla were crushing the fascist 17th Army in the Crimea. The commander of this army, General Eniki, a specialist in creating fortifications, lost one defensive position after another. Despite the stubborn resistance of the enemy, our troops were taken Armyansk, Kerch, Evpatoria, Yalta, Simferopol, Bakhchisarai, Suda. The next in line was the glorious Sevastopol. About all this I told the fighters and commanders at the next political information. Gradually, Lieutenant Yelagin drew me into educational work with the personnel, not easy, but necessary for every commander. The mood was excellent. The dream to go to the front at the head of the unit was realized. From his father and from home received good news. Marina is near. Meanwhile, the stay of the division in reserve was coming to an end. One day was received the order to march. The final point of our movement was a small railroad station, Kivertsi Rivny region. The division became part of the 3rd Guards Army. Once again, the road. Kilometre poles are running back, telegraph wires are flickering, trees are flashing. In the lowlands of meadows, along the banks of rivulets, lakes and ponds peep white willow, and on the hillocks, shoals of tender green first grass. The warm spring air blows caressingly. Huddled around the doorways, the soldiers look at the spring pictures passing by. A song is heard under the harmonics and trophy German accordions. A cheerful song, Alexander Terentьevich. Lieutenant Yelagin touches my shoulder. Yi is a sign of good mood and strong spirit. We listen to the cheerful, whistling refrain of Kalinka and involuntarily pick up the tune ourselves. At stops while we are waiting for oncoming trains, we hear our troops are expanding the bridgehead on the right bank of the Dniester. They are fighting on the close approaches to Sevastopol. Our aviation strikes on enemy reserves in Poland and Romania, Czechoslovakia. The holiday is beginning on our street. Ivan Ivanovich. I turn to Yelagin. The cities of Zitomir, Novograd-Volynski, dozens of other towns, villages and settlements are left behind, different in size, geographical location, but almost equally devastated. At the station, Kivertsi arrived at night. In the nearby forest, the command was heard. The wagons came to life, the clanking of doors being pushed open, the crunch of rubble and slag under hundreds of soldiers' boots. Sensing the end of the journey, the horses rumbled. Only anti-aircraft gunners did not move from their places. Their task was the same as before, to guard the regiment. Quickly unloaded the property. The formation and roll call were not long. Ivan Ivanovich and I were disturbed by brothers Goropsi. Feodosi and Methodius asked permission to visit their relatives, assured that they would catch up with us. On my own responsibility, I let the sergeants go. Will they let us down, sparrows? I don't think so. The guys are serious. As if in response to our conversation, familiar figures appeared at the end of the wooden platform. There they are. Theodosius and Methodius ran up to us. Out of breath, joyful, they announced their arrival. Did you find your relatives? Of course we found them, Theodosius answered for both of them. Well, we'll talk later when we have time. Now go to your platoons, they are waiting for you there. The brothers clearly turned and ran to find their units. On the same day, April 23, the Corps, division, and consequently the regiment became part of the First Ukrainian Front. We guessed that major events would soon unfold, and personnel and equipment were unloaded at stations, semi-stations, railroad sidings. At night, the troops, observing all kinds of precautions, moved to the areas indicated to them. We did not know that the actions of our troops in Belarusia, Baltic, Karelia and other places were soon destined to result in a general offensive of the Soviet army along the entire Soviet-German front. On the 1st of May, the units concentrated in the forests. We were to replace the units of the 1st Czechoslovak Brigade. We had heard about the fighting deeds of Czechoslovak internationalists who participated on the side of the Soviet army in the fight against the Nazi invaders. And so military fate brought us together. We looked at the uniforms with interest, listened to the unfamiliar accent of soldiers, non-commissioned officers and officers. Cheerful, fit soldiers and commanders made a good impression. After the formalities of receiving the defense section from the 2nd Separate Battalion of the Czechoslovak Brigade, the anthems of the two countries were sung. The unusual ceremony remained in the memory of each of us for a long time. On one of the first days of May, the Partor arrived to the battalion, above average height, broad-shouldered, slender, with a northern accent. Lieutenant Malygin, Mercha, introduced himself, and after a short pause, Vasily Fedorovich, I have arrived at your disposal. Vasily Fedorovich was not a regular officer. It was evident from his dishevelled gait and his report. My attention was attracted by the awards and the patches on his uniform that testified to his wounds. Had a chance to smell the front powder, flashed a thought. What did you do before the war, Vasily Fedorovich? Lieutenant Yelagin inquired. I'll stay a forester in the Arkhangelsk region. I started the war as a political fighter. Malygin had time to fight near Rostov. As deputy political officer of the company, participated in the Battle of Stalingrad, graduated from courses for political officers. He makes a good impression. Ivan Ivanovich expressed his opinion after the lieutenant left. He has combat experience, understands the issues of party political work. I also have such an opinion. So the battalion was replenished with one more officer. The party leader turned out to be a man of no time. Vasily Fedorovich more than once led people into the attacks, helped fighters and commanders to hold in the defense, but it was a little later. We continued to prepare for the upcoming battles. The battalion participated in a regimental exercise on the theme breaking through heavily fortified enemy defences in wooded and swampy terrain with forcing a water barrier. The exercise revealed the strengths and weaknesses in the training of the personnel, errors and blunders tried to correct. Here we celebrated the anniversary of the formation of the division. In the anniversary order summarised the results of the combat path of the compound for a year of fierce fighting. It said, "The division together with the entire Red Army has passed a glorious battle path from a small river Lavation K to Desna, Soj, Denaya per Berezina, sweeping away and destroying the Nazi invaders on their way, liberating inch by inch native land. For a year of fighting, the division passed over 460 kilometers with fights. More than 600 settlements were liberated. The festive order called us to new victories in the fight against the Nazi invaders and ended with the words, 'Death to the German invaders.' On the night of May 24, we marched and by morning concentrated on the specified line. One day, the battalion commanders of the divisions of the 1st Echelon gathered Commander Colonel General Gordov. High, slender, trim, Vasily Nikolaevich made a pleasant impression on me. The manner of his conversation also impressed me. We were talking about the offensive. Vasily Nikolaevich outlined the situation in general terms, then began to be interested in how the combatants know the tactical and technical characteristics of the weapons in service of the rifle regiment and know how to use them in battle, how familiar with mines, wire fences, not only ours, but also German. It is necessary for you, comrades battalion commanders, to know all this like 2 times 2, repeated the commander when any of us could not express his thought correctly or found it difficult to answer. Vasily Nikolaevich Gordov walked along the aisle with a firm, springy gait, stopping now and then, asking any of us, "What do you think? Or is your comrade's answer correct?" If the Colonel General was satisfied with the answer, he immediately praised the officer and set an example for others. In the course of the war, I did not have a chance to meet Colonel General Gordov, although I heard a lot about him. Demanding harsh, this man was merciless even to small manifestations of confusion, harshly asked his subordinates for mistakes, even the sometimes unnecessarily harshly, then often suppressed their will and initiative, confidence in their abilities. Perhaps the bitterness of the failures of the first years of the war left an imprint on his character. The 41st and 42nd years, Vasily Nikolaevich spent on the front line and learned well the true price of weak-willedness, disorderliness. Until June 10, we continued to be on the same line of defense. Both sides were conducting intensified reconnaissance. At night, search parties seized soldiers who strayed while on duty or lagged behind and dragged them to their own. On these occasions, there was commotion on the front line. A series of coloured rockets furrowed the dark sky, gun and machine gun fire, and sometimes mortar and artillery batteries joined in. The fire was mainly conducted from reserve positions. Continuing to improve the defence in engineering, the soldiers often found shells, cartridges, grenades corroded from time. Weapons of the First World War. The regiment's defence site was located on a historical site. From here in 1916, the troops of the Southwestern Front under the leadership of General of Cavalry A. Brusilov carried out a brilliant defence of the regiment. A. Brusilov carried out a brilliant breakthrough of the Austro-Hungarian troops, and trenches as such were not preserved, but their rectangular outlines were clearly visible on the ground. The reinforced concrete caps were not badly preserved. Some of them were even adapted for firing points. Naturally, we all became interested in the events of those years. At first, there were a variety of opinions. Some officers said that the offensive had failed in the end, so it was not worth talking about it. I do not remember on what occasion. During a break in one of the meetings, a conversation about Brusilov came up. Guitarist General, Captain Vechtamov waved his hand. "What can you take from him?" "Do not tell me, Comrade Vechtamov." We turned to Ivan Nikitich, the head of the political department, Lieutenant Colonel Zhivago. "I've made some inquiries about General Brusilov. They are quite, I tell you, curious. Alexei Alexeyevich Brusilov is an interesting person. He took part in the Russian-Turkish War of 1877-1878. In 1900, he commanded a division, later a corps, an army, and finally a front. Brusilov's brilliant breakthrough is an example of military art, which put Brusilov among the best military commanders of the First World War. Brusilov was wrong in his assessment of the revolutionary events taking place in Russia. But already in 1920 he issued a proclamation to former officers, in which he called on them to defend Soviet Russia from the aggression of bourgeois and medieval Poland. In 1923 he was Inspector of Cavalry of the Red Army. In 1924 he retired, but remained at the disposal of the Revolutionary Military Council. And in the end it is not about General Brasilov, although he is not such a simple figure in the history of the Russian army, but in the glory of our national arms, in the heroism of Russian soldiers and officers, their courage and devotion to the motherland. This is what we need to emphasize in conversations with soldiers and commanders. We found in our regiment and a living witness to the events that took place nearly 30 years ago. With interest listened to the soldiers' memories of Sergeant Romanov, a participant in the First World War, Cavalier of St. George. He told about his fellow soldiers of those distant years, who fought in the name of Mother Russia, about their courage, fortitude, selflessness. Zakhar Petrovich had something to say about the fighting deeds of his friends, with whom he travelled the fiery roads of that, and he himself added the Order of Glory of the II degree to those old military awards. Party and Komsomol meetings were held in those days. The best of the best soldiers joined the party and Komsomol. We had Volodya Baranov, an energetic, cheerful man. He cared about everything, starting from the issues of combat training and end with small details of the soldier's rest, an issue of combat leaflets, flyers, textual readings of newspapers, discussion of articles of various nature, organization of question and answer evenings. How can you list all that this restless man did? Where he was, there were jokes, laughter and songs. The members of the Komsomol Bureau, enterprising, assertive in their work, matched him. That's why the Komsomol work in the battalion, and in the companies, as they say, with a key. Komsomol members were good assistants to commanders in all our affairs. In the battalion, on the initiative of Komsomol activists, exchanged experience of masters of fire, from small arms and artillery weapons, held a gathering of gunners of machine guns, anti-tank guns, mortars and guns. We lived the upcoming offensive and waited for changes on the fronts of the Great Patriotic War. Sovinform reports, newspapers summarized the results of the autumn, winter and spring campaigns, reported on local battles. The enemy was defeated near Leningrad and Novgorod, in Ukraine, and the Crimea. We welcomed with joy the news that on the night of June 6, Allied troops crossed La Mépèche and began landing on the coast of northern France. At the same time, their aircraft struck the enemy garrisons stationed in the cities of Calais and Dunkirk. Finally, the long-awaited Second Front was Meanwhile, summer was gaining strength. Warm and sunny June of the 44th passed with short thunderstorm rains, birds' homonym, nightingale trills, tart smells of flowers. Nature seemed to beckon with dreams of 20-year-old guys dressed in army uniforms, brought back memories to 40-year-olds. The former, in the evenings, in their free time from duty, sang songs or made intricate pretzels with their feet to the accompaniment of harmonicas, stomped so that the ground trembled. The latter, gathered in circles, talked about their pre-war life, remembered the families with whom the Nazi invasion had separated them. One late evening, going around the guard with Lieutenant Maligan, we witnessed one of these conversations. I received a letter the other day. My family wrote how they had dropped out, though it was difficult. Only women were left in the village. My wife says that a neighbor sent a letter to his wife. He is fighting on the Leningrad front. He wrote that he had acquired a finca. The neighbor was indignant. My neighbor fell for it too. She asked me, "You must have found a woman there too. Why don't you write letters home? I'll get my act together and I'll pull her eyes out and your eyes too. You old sinner." A burst of laughter drowned out the voices for a while. We approached a group of soldiers sitting near the dugout. The soldiers stood up. So what about the finca, Comrade Zverev? Nay, confused, Comrade Senior Lieutenant, cold weapons with nationality. We, answered a broad-shouldered, 40-something soldier. The soldiers jumped with laughter. Sit down, and me and the party will sit down too. Jim sat down on a neatly rolled-up cloak tent, offered by Senior Sergeant Nikolaev. Thank you, Aleximovich. Nikolaev looked at me somehow surprised. But when I addressed Junior Sergeant Zhigora by name and patronymic, I realized that I knew not only him. It was a small detail, but it somehow immediately favored us soldiers and sergeants. We had a relaxed conversation about our affairs, about the offensive of the Leningrad front, the Allies, the 3rd anniversary of the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, and it so happened that almost everyone remembered the comrades who died on the front line. Without their feet, summarized the conversation Vasily Fyodorovich Maligan. There would be no today our day. They were the first. They did not falter. May the land of the fatherland be in their souls. They started, and we must finish the defeat of the fascists. It's our sacred duty before their blessed. In the silence we could hear a corncrake shrieking, and in the neighbouring marsh a spruce grouse, awakened by someone, was giving its voice. We could hear the whistling of the air, full of night moisture, being cut by the wings of bats. Will we go soon? Private Aksabe Mildanov broke the prolonged pause and looked up at me with a swarthy face with slanting eyes. Soon, comrades, soon. In the first days of July, the command began to pay more attention to reconnaissance work. We spent most of our time on the front line or at the layout of the area of the upcoming battles. Again and again practiced possible variants of the course of hostilities. The commander and chief of staff demanded more and more new information about the enemy. Subordinates of Major Valentin Korotayev together with regimental scouts worked at full strength. The enemy's defense consists of 3 strips, containing full-profile trenches, passages, trenches, firing, main and reserve positions for artillery, mortars, tanks, various kinds of engineering barriers. Not only large settlements, farms, individual yards, but also hills and heights dominating over the terrain turned into resistance nodes. The enemy created strongholds in Kiselin, Utii, Semerinka, Lukovom. Especially the fascists strengthened Vladimir Volinsky. The city was girdled by several trenches, covered by continuous minefields and wire barriers. In front of our battalion, the Hitlerites' front line was on the eastern outskirts of Kiselin, the northern outskirts of Semerinka settlement and Shyoknok colony, and consisted of 2 or 3 trenches with engineering barriers and protected by artillery and mortar fire. Its second strip, the so-called line of Prince Eugene, stretched along the western bank of the Turia River. According to the prisoners, it was the main line. Here, under the cover of engineering structures, the enemy hoped to withdraw, if required by the situation, parts of the first, to avoid unnecessary losses. The third line of defence ran along the western Bug River. Its equipment was not yet finished. The enemy rear units were doing engineering work here. The time of the offensive was approaching. Listening to reports from the fronts, we sincerely rejoiced. Following the Leningrad and Karelian fronts, the First Baltic and 3 Byelorussian fronts went on the offensive. Our troops in Belarus defeated the Vitebsk and Orsha groups of the enemy, forced the Berezina River, and on July 3 captured the capital of the Republic, the city of Minsk. When looking at the map, one could not help but notice that on this section of the front there was a huge gap, which the German fascist command was unlikely to be able to patch. In the 10th of July, the division headquarters held a meeting of officers, up to and including the company commander. The command was interested in our readiness to break through the enemy defences, and we were briefed on the latest orders of the Corps headquarters and intelligence data. The day before, the battalion conducted a reconnaissance by a rifle company. Several days in a row we observed the behaviour of the Germans. We found that after lunch they, as a rule, leaving in the first trench duty shifts, went to the dugouts to rest. Even the storks, whose nest was miraculously preserved on the top of a tree between the first and second enemy trenches, calmed down. This time we decided to use for the operation. Reconnaissance by combat has entered into the practice of combat operations of troops. Complex in organization, difficult in execution, it was associated with losses of personnel. But before the offensive, it was necessary to know the enemy's fire system, its engineering structures, the presence of forces. Therefore, the command consciously made some sacrifices for the successful fulfillment of the upcoming task. Commanders, of course, sought to minimize losses and used for this purpose all ways and opportunities. This time we managed to conduct reconnaissance almost without losses. The Germans were used to the fact that we started fighting, as a rule, in the morning, and here the guns hit them in the afternoon. Following the artillery attack, the infantry attacked. While the enemy came to his senses, the 5th Company reached his trench. Prisoners were taken samples of weapons. The fascists had to open fire from the depths, which allowed us to identify a lot of new firepower in the enemy defences. My success pleased me also because this combat reconnaissance was the first in my position as a combatant. The reconnaissance group, headed by Sergeant Volkov, brought valuable information from behind the front line. In front of us are still facing parts of the 72nd Infantry Division, said in his speech at the meeting Colonel Abashev. The enemy is not particularly active, according to the prisoners. The fascists are concerned about the situation in Belarus, although their command is trying to keep the personnel in ignorance of the new defeat, sending positive reports to the unit. But the truth cannot be hidden. Soldiers' telegraph brings news that willingly or unwillingly demoralize the personnel. Fyodor Fedorovich coughed, looked at us and continued. I can see from your faces that you are satisfied with the current situation. I won't hide it, it pleases me too. However, this in no way gives us the right to calm down. The enemy, by virtue of his diligence, German punctuality in the execution of orders, and they, as you know, one is stricter than the other, will fight seriously. Hence the conclusion. We should not count on easy success. We need to continue to seriously prepare for the upcoming battles, aim at the subordinates. Then Colonel Abashev introduced us to the commanders of attached and supporting the division of parts and units, dwelled on the organization of interaction, providing fire joints and flanks, anti-aircraft cover. Some recent days in has intensified its actions, whether it was flights to reconnoiter the depth of our defences, or whether the German command drew conclusions from the Belarusian operation, where it did not detect the concentration of Soviet armies in time. Sekomdiv Danilovsky in general terms familiarized us with the upcoming combat task, then dwelled on the preparation of assault squads. Understand, comrades, the enemy defense, which we have to break, saturated with firepower, various kinds of engineering structures. Without direct fire guns, sappers' rifle units will be difficult to cope with the tasks. That is why it is important to continue to put together assault squads, to ensure that shooters, artillerymen, sappers with half a word understood each other and acted as a well-oiled mechanism. The head of the political department demanded further strengthening of party political work in order to develop an offensive spirit in the personnel. Here I met the head of the operational department, Major Rumyantsev. "Heard about you, Sasha," said Peter Vasilievich. "I'm glad that everything is going well. Your superiors are pleased with you. Congratulations on your promotion to the rank of captain." Rumyantsev shook my hand warmly, took a step back, squinted his eyes. "Well, of course, you are due." But obviously noticing my embarrassment, hastened to say, "No, just kidding. You know I'm not into potions," he said. "But because of the fact that you rarely call, I take offense. You're upstairs. We're downstairs. We respect the chain of command. We don't bother our superiors." I got out of it. Pyotr Vasilievich smiled. He took me under his arm, took me aside. "We haven't told anyone yet, but it's about to start. We're waiting for the order. Get ready. This is the first exam for you in your new position." Thank you, Pyotr Vasilievich. I'll try to pass this exam." No sooner had I returned to the battalion than I got a call from regimental headquarters. Major Pavliuk was assembling the officers. The orderly saddled the horses again, hurried with Yelagin to the call. In a small headquarters dugout, so many people that there was no place to fall. And by the faces of the officers of the headquarters, it was easy to guess. Something had happened. Received an order, began the meeting. Valentin Evstafievich Pavliuk. "Tomorrow we go on the offensive." Finally, involuntarily burst out at the commander of the 1st Battalion. Shendyuk elaborated on the upcoming task, warned of the need to monitor the enemy. According to agency data, the Nazis may withdraw from the line of defense. It is important not to miss the moment to organize a timely pursuit. Chief of Staff Major Nikolai Sergeyevich Modin familiarized us with the content of the combat order, demanded to bring it to the commanders of companies, platoons and all personnel, once again check all documents. On our return to the battalion with Lieutenant Yelagin, we discussed the placement of political workers in the units. Time flew imperceptibly in business. Sometime after midnight I came out of the dugout and breathed in the cool air with pleasure. There was an amazing silence. Even the frogs had stopped their croaking on the nearby sedge-covered lake, and only from time to time the voices of a brood of ducks, disturbed by someone, came from midnight. Alexander Terentyevich. Bukharin's bass voice came from behind. "So are you, Nikolai Yakovlevich?" Bukharin came closer, stopped. One could hear the wheel of a cigarette lighter flickering in his hand, smelling of cigarette smoke. From the left flank of the front, from behind the hills and forests, came a rumble. We did not pay much attention to it. Little else can happen on the front line. But as it turned out, it was the advanced detachments of the advancing units began a reconnaissance battle. In our lane was still quiet. In the conversation, we did not notice how the edge of the sky turned white, and from the neighbouring lake came the sounds of a growing concert of its inhabitants. A cuckoo gave its voice from the older forest. A new day was dawning. In the meantime, breakfast came. Messengers ran from the battalion headquarters to the companies. Groups of soldiers with thermoses over their shoulders reached the household allowance point. In the evening it was decided to feed the personnel at dawn, and the petty officers tried to fulfill the order. "Let's go and have a snack," Ma proposed Bukharin. "The orderlies have probably already delivered the food." "No, I don't feel like it." "We need to refuel, Alexander Terentevich. At the same time, and clean yourself up. Wash up, shave, I'm used to going into battle, as they say, in full dress. Maybe you say it's superstition. No, we're going for a holy cause." Nikolai Yakovlevich was silent. "When I was a child, in spring the men went to ploughing in the spring and in the fall to harvest in the best that they had. Clean, tidy, went as on holiday, realizing the importance of the cause. Fighting for us is like sowing or reaping for a peasant, and it must be done with clean hands." In about 20 minutes we finished our early breakfast. The liaison officer delivered an address from the Military Council of the Army. The liaison officers on behalf of Lieutenant Yelagin distributed leaflets to party and Komsomol activists, and those immediately, in the trenches, read the appeal to the soldiers. In the meantime, the rumble we had heard in the evening intensified. It grew and grew wider. It was artillery firing on the reconnaissance fire means and reserves of the enemy, called the regiment commander. "Scouts report. The enemy began to withdraw. What do your observers report?" "We haven't found anything yet, Comrade First. I'll clarify it. I'll clarify, but also get ready for pursuit. Your task is not to let the Krauts break away." "Do you?" "Yes, I understand." "Good. Increase surveillance." See, at 5 o'clock we started the pursuit. The 3rd Battalion was on the right, and the 1st Battalion on the left, towards the colony of Zichenok. We were in the middle, through binoculars. It was clearly visible how the Germans were hurriedly leaving the trenches and hastily retreating to the dirt road towards the small village of Tierding. Combat guards reported that the enemy also withdrew from mortar and artillery positions. "Why the hurry?" Captain Okremenko raised his eyebrows in surprise. "It's not like the Germans. Usually they cling to every line. Something is not right here." In response to Nikolai Elisevich's words, I could only shrug my shoulders. We then did not know, and could not know, the whole picture of the beginning of the operation and the fact that the enemy, frightened by the bypasses of our troops of his groups and defeat in Belarus, hastily withdrew their units to the second line of defence, apparently intending to keep us there. But, as the course of further events showed, he failed to do so. The pursuit of the enemy was mostly successful, although not without delays in front of favourable for the Germans' borders, where we had to deploy, to organise the battle according to all the rules of tactics. While the battalion took the village of Semarinka, the neighbour to the left seized the colony of Zichenok, and the 3rd Battalion engaged in battle for the village of Kiselin. The 8th Company of Senior Lieutenant Grigory Slobodnyuk was the first to break into it, but was forced to lie down under crossfire of rifle and machine guns, and then to retreat completely. "Slowly move forward. The Chief of Staff of the regiment hurried us. Do not let the enemy break away." Hiwadine Medin's impatience was understandable. He was asked from above, and we tried to do everything to accelerate the advance of companies and platoons. However, the desire and even skill of fighters and commanders is not all for success. Having met minefields, wire barriers, we had to stop, make passages, often under rifle and machine gun or artillery fire. The regiment's offensive strip turned out to be stuffed with mines of different systems, like watermelon seeds, both in layers and intermixed with anti-personnel and anti-tank mines. The difficulty was that most of them had been laid in winter, and now in the summer vegetation it was almost impossible to detect them at once. Retreating, the fascists mined buildings, laid charges under bridges over numerous streams and diversion ditches. I remember the case of Lieutenant Zosim Abramovuki, commander of the sapper platoon. Regimental sappers in the offensive go together with the riflemen, and even paved the way for the infantrymen. This time there was no accepts. Sappers were part of the assault groups. Having caught hold of the first houses in Kiselin, the rifle units of the 3rd Battalion tried to build on their success. Running across one of the courtyards, the soldiers heard a child crying. Lieutenant Armovsky stopped. The voice came from the house. The officer went to the door. He looked at the doorpost with his usual glance and did not notice anything alarming. Meanwhile, the child continued to scream. The sapper carefully pulled the door toward himself. There was an explosion. The lieutenant, drenched in blood, fell, and in the doorway rushed the desperate mother. What kind of cynicism and brutality was necessary to mine the entrance to the house, purposely leaving a small child in it? The Nazi sapper definitely knew that a normal person would not stand it, would rush to the call, and first of all the mother would do it. If Abramovsky had been a minute late, surely something irreparable would have happened to the woman. Even now, more than 30 years later, I, a man who has been through the war, seen hundreds of deaths, cannot calmly remember about this case. Lieutenant Zosim Abramovsky was severely wounded, but survived. Today he lives at the station Puksa in the Arkhangelsk region. Kiselin's fate was decided in the following way. The 1st Battalion of the 828th Rifle Regiment, having overcome a swamp with a rivulet, came to the edge of the forest to the right of the settlement. Meanwhile, a company of our battalion, commanded by a young but experienced officer, Ivan Arkipovich Kovalev, under the cover of a small forest, began to bypass Kiselin on the left. The 3rd Battalion was pressing the Germans from the front. Finding themselves half encircled, they began to withdraw, but it was too late. The road to Tivadine was shot by our rifle and machine gun fire. Only a small part of the garrison managed to escape. Senior Lieutenant Kovalev reported to me that he had destroyed up to a company of the enemy, continuing to pursue the enemy. By the end of the day, we came to his combat guard on the strip of Prince Eugene. Semirinka, the colony of Zichinok, Kiselin, and Lukov were left behind, smoking in ruins. On the right and left, the neighbors engaged the enemy. Shooting did not stop in the rear. Not far from Lukau, in a small forest, a company of machine gunners of Captain Sergeyev's regiment continued to destroy a rather large group of surrounded fascists. I can't help but say a few words about Captain Sergeyev. A man of desperate courage, Ivan Alexeyevich got into difficult situations more than once, but always came out of the fights victorious. Modest, not particularly talkative, even shy in everyday life, he transformed during the battles. Usually he did not wear awards, but before accomplishing a combat task, he attached them to his uniform. His subordinates, seeing him with orders and medals, captain on parade, wait for orders. The commander and chief of staff of the regiment threw the company to the most difficult areas. And this day she got a difficult job, as the battalion just had time to surround the enemy group, as the order came, to transfer it for the subsequent defeat of the company of machine gunners and continue the pursuit. Captain Sergeyev, who arrived immediately, familiarized himself with the situation, and when asked by Captain Bukharin how he thought to destroy the superior enemy, Sikard will not give out. The pig will not eat Nikolai Yakovlevich. When the Krauts came in, they were kicked in the teeth. Let them continue to think that they are in a tight ring, and here we will think over how to take them better. Sergeyev took off his cap, smoothed a hedgehog of hair, and thoughtfully continued. Of course, guns and mortars would not hurt us, but where to get them? Major Modin can't ask for 40-50 tanks by daylight. When I mentioned it, he gave me a whole lecture about the importance of escort guns in pursuit. You'll have to use your own resources. He's a calculating man. Yeah, well, we'll figure something out. And he did. Not far from one of the farms, fighters found a serviceable tractor. Sergeyev decided to use the machine. Several empty barrels were attached to the tractor. The tractor driver was found among the machine gunners. With the onset of darkness, he started the engine and began circling the machine around the forest, imitating the concentration of our tanks. Then in one place, then in another, the machine gunners opened fire. This was repeated several times. Finally, the nerves of the Germans could not stand it. They began. What was the surprise of the prisoners, especially the officers, when a tractor drove up to the column and the captain kissed the grimy tractor driver? Only then it became clear to the fascists what fishing rod they had fallen for. That was Captain Ivan Alexeyevich Sergeyev, who later on the Vistula became a deputy commissar, and some time later took over a rifle battalion. At dusk, having captured the village of Rudnya, the regiment anchored to the right from a small unnamed river with muddy, marshy banks to the dirt road leading to the village of Ozdutuchi. Directly in front of the battalion stretched a swamp. Behind it blackened a large wooded area. In our direction the enemy was not very active. Only from time to time from the edge of the forest gave a voice mortar battery. But from the right flank, where the 828th Rifle Regiment of Lieutenant Colonel Nikolai Viktorovich Krasovsky was advancing, came the rumble of battle. The sky was coloured with bizarre zigzags of rockets, tracer bursts of machine guns and machine guns. The company of anti-tank rifles supporting us, followed by mortar and machine gun platoons. Krasovsky have a hard time. Returned from the front line, sympathized with Captain Bukharin. It's not easy. I agreed with him. The scouts from Kovalev have not returned yet. No. Something delayed. Swamp, so they are delayed. I was in the 4th Company when the scout group arrived. You should have seen them, pure lions. As Junior Sergeant Yuneshev put it, they've been to the underworld, swamp sludge up to their nostrils, be damned this swamp. When we entered the line, I warned the company commanders about continuous reconnaissance. We were required to do one thing, not to let the enemy stealthily withdraw. From the companies were sent out a reconnaissance group, which were at the front edge of the fascist defence. Groups of the 4th and 6th companies returned. The 5th was delayed. To midnight, the sky began to frown, began to drizzle rain. We only lacked it in addition to the swamp which was to overcome in the morning. In short, the mood was below average. But as they say, there was not a penny, but suddenly an Altin. The scouts of the 5th Company report us. There was no solid line of trenches in front of the battalion's right flank. The fascists were engaged in a focal defence. Reporting this to the regimental commander, I suggested under cover of darkness to infiltrate behind the enemy's front line and hit his rear. A good idea, and supported me Major Pavlyuk. But do not hurry, we still have time. I'll contact someone and call you. 20 minutes later the call rang. Valentin Yevstafevich said that Major Kulyabin had left for us. He will clarify the task on the spot. Nikolai Afanasyevich Kulyabin was accompanied by machine gunners. On his tired face it was easy to guess. The deputy commander of the regiment on the political part did not rest. It's quiet here, Nikolai Afanasyevich said in a calm voice. A pure resort. But the weather is not suitable for rest. Oh, Comrade Commander? Not suitable, Comrade Major, and not to rest. I don't understand why we're lying down. All day we've been rushing, and here we are, an unforeseen pause. What a rush. You know the saying. Take your time. It suits us best now. Neighbours have fallen behind and Krasovsky's business is still bad. The enemy has counterattacked the regiment several times. We've received an ore. Together with the 828th, we'll strike at Utii. Nasi, Comrade Major. If it's clear and there are no questions, let's go to the companies. Are the men awake? Not to her. We set off. It stopped raining. The ground was steaming. The air was saturated with moisture, so it seemed thick and heavy. Like in a bathhouse, combat. Looks like it. The day was hot. The peak of summer. Pass. Came from the darkness an imperious voice. Sure, sir. The fighter called a recall at the demand. They came closer. Are you Manco? That's right. Comrade Captain, I am. Where's the platoon commander? On the right flank, at the machine gunners. Hearing the voices, the soldiers who were free from duty came to us. Soon appeared and Senior Lieutenant Peter Serpiu, raising his hand to his headdress. The platoon commander began to report. No need, Senior Lieutenant Kulyabin. I am already familiar with your cases. Combat reported. Major nodded in my direction, asked the officer. Yes, you dest. A little worn out. The terrain is swampy. In some areas the boots go into the ground up to the shins. But I'm okay, but the guys are having a hard time. Wherever they dig groundwater, we have to adapt. Machine gun and anti-tank gun platforms. Shooting cells had to be raised and lined with sod. The grass saves the day. You see, it grew knee-high or even higher. The dugout had to be equipped on the back slope of this hill. The senior lieutenant pointed to a small island covered with birch trees among the swampy landscape. Not bad, he approved Kulyabin. Let's go to the dugout. Tell the company commander to gather the men there, except for the duty shift. Soon we came to a slender birch on the side of a steep-headed hill. On the left, in front of the enemy, illuminated the area with rockets. From the right flank came the incessant chatter of machine guns and machine guns. The crowd is cautious, said someone's voice. You will be careful. The major looked at the speaker. When the ground is burning under your feet. Nikolai Afanasyevich looked at the soldiers and commanders, said hello to Company Nikolai Chugunov. Come here, comrades, and sit down. The deputy commander of the regiment on the political part familiarized us with the latest reports of the Sovinform Bureau, dwelt in detail on the successes of the offensive of our front. Nikolai Afanasyevich spoke leisurely, but capaciously. Each of his words reached my heart and pleased me. It was pleasant to hear that the troops of the front liberated the town of Gorokhov, and the cavalry mechanized group of General Baranov entered into the breakthrough and entered the area of Holonov, forced the Western Bug. Joyful and other news about the rapid advance of our troops. To the overall success, he said Kolyabin, we contribute, and you and me. Division units liberated Semarinka, Kiselin, Alexandrovka, Ulyanovka, Adamovka, Tevaidin. Utii, Vladimir Volinsky are next in line, and further. Nikolai Afanasyevich thought for a while. A smile ran across his weathered face. He continued in a louder voice. Next is the border, comrades. You see the border beyond which is already the land of Poland. Is it a tempting prospect? You bet. Junior Sergeant Fyodorlik stood up. How many dreamed of the time when we would throw the fascist scum off our land? Word for word. Junior Sergeants Efim Solup, Pyotr Kalinka, Private Anton Nizhnik and others joined the conversation. She visited the 5th and 4th companies. Nikolai Afanasyevich was satisfied with the mood of the personnel. At parting, he shook my hand, thanked me for the training of people. Summarize. Yeah, for you, Altunin, I'm not worried. I'll go to my neighbors and see how they are doing. Maybe you'll stay, Comrade Major, I offered him. We'll rest after the war, Alexander Terentyevich. Then we'll get some sleep. We don't have time now. Tomorrow will be a hard day. Be well. Don't be so hot. They tell me you're not taking care of yourself. It could end badly. I've heard you too. You've led your companies into attack many times. That's when it's hopeless. And I've lived a little longer than you. Understand? Be careful. They say a bullet goes around a bullet. Kulyabin, accompanied by machine gunners, left for the 1st Battalion. I walked around the trench for some time, thinking over Nikolai Afanasyevich's words. Think about the possibility of bypassing Utii. Krasovsky is unlikely to be able to overturn the enemy from the front. I decided to scout the area to the left of the village, called the headquarters. Major Modin answered the phone. Not bad. Nikolai Sergeyevich supported me. Admittedly, to scout this area and wanted to entrust you, but you, it turns out, ahead of. I'm glad that our thoughts have converged. Go ahead. I entrusted Kovalev with the task. The Reconnaissance returned at dawn. The company commander reporter. There is an opportunity reads to bypass Utii on the left side. The enemy, hoping that the swamp is impassable, has not mined the area. There is no guard. Ivan Archipovich is an experienced officer. More than once he took the men to search. On July 11, in the area of the colony of Barbalova, Loza led a group to capture a control prisoner. The group destroyed 2 bunkers and up to 40 Hitlerites, captured 2 Germans. For successful performance of the task of Alev was presented to the Order of Patriotic War of the I degree. No. Take into account perhaps you will lead the whole regiment. Don't worry, Comrade Captain. Everything will be in order. Just in case I've left a watch in those reeds. Thank you, Ivan Archipovich. Kovalev asked permission to leave for the company. I will not delay. Go. The senior lieutenant went out. Silence closed over the trench. I could hear a bird crying somewhere nearby, the grass rustling under the sentry's feet. Nearby on a trench coat, Captain Bukharin was dozing. The signalman was scribbling something on a sheet of paper. The telephone was silent. Admiring the flame of the smokestack, I was going through the events of today. In general, it had turned out well. Another piece of native land was liberated from the Nazis. And this is the most important in my present life. What are you thinking about, Commander? Bukharin raised his head. Are you awake, Nikolai Yakovlevich? What sleep is there? Just a lot of fuss. I heard your conversation with Modin and Kovalev. It's a clever idea. It seems to me that the Krauts will hardly defeat the Krauts head-on. The enemy is firmly entrenched in Utii. We'll have to get involved. And we have to do it wisely. You can't do anything with a frontal attack. That's all they're waiting for. They want to buy time, hold us off as long as possible, weaken us. We need to get to Turia, Volodymyr Volinsky Bug, and here we can't do without maneuver if we want to fulfill the task successfully. We need to bypass Utii, leave them to the second echelon. He'll finish off the Krauts. But there's a question of how they won't strike in the flank during the bypass. Strengthen Kovalev. I understood Bukharin's thought. Yes, give him a machine gun and mortar companies, or even ask the regimental commander for a battery for fire cover. It would be nice to get a battery. Lieutenant Yeligin, who arrived from the combat guard, was inclined to the same thought. Ivan Ivanovich was concerned. 2 columns of enemy vehicles, judging by the rumble of engines, loaded with something heavy, had passed into the area of Utii. From the river and the swamp fog rises, warned Yeligin, as if the Germans did not pull any tricks. I have ordered to strengthen the means of duty, Alexander Terentyevich. Thank you, Ivan Ivanovich. Our fears were justified. In the morning the enemy met Krasovsky's battalions with strong rifle and machine gun fire. Rifle chains were forced to lie down and then to roll back. The attack without artillery preparation was not successful. We had to organize an offensive according to all the rules of military science. While the division headquarters pulled up the artillery, clarified the tasks of the regiment, I received a call from Major Pavlyuk. Nada to gist. Are you ready to let the 3rd Battalion bypass Utii? Yes, I'm ready. Covered by part of the forces on the flank, the battalion began to bypass the village on the left. On the right, the Krasovtsi were bypassing Utii. By 12 o'clock, the units joined forces and engaged the enemy. The loop around the village tightened. Everything is going well so far. Having listened to my report, Pavlyuk said, get ready to storm Utii after the artillery preparation. 15 minutes later, the sky was split by artillery thunder. Batteries of divisional and regimental artillery mortars opened fire. The enemy positions were covered with the smoke of explosions. Our aviation attack bomb load came on the enemy's defense. The blow was so strong that even at the battalion's NP it was felt how the ground shook. They're giving us a thrush. Did not withstand the commander of the communications platoon. I turned around at the voice and habitually asked, Okumenko communication with the companies. But immediately remembered that yesterday Nikolai Elisevich was wounded. It was a pity to let my battle friend go to the hospital, but it couldn't be helped. We had to part. Is there a connection with the companies, Senior Lieutenant? I asked loudly. That's right. There is a connection. Tell them to get ready to attack. The enemy's defense continued to puff with fountains of explosions, fiery tongues, black smoke. Everything that could burn was burning. Houses, buildings, trees, even Yeligin spat with annoyance. They chopped down the forest. Splinters fly, Commissar, Bukharin muttered in reply. Our cannoneers are bypassing village houses with fire, as if it was not the fascists themselves who set the fire. That's so. But it's a pity Nikolai Yakovlevich. I understand people's grief, but I think people should be pitied first of all. Everything else is a matter of time. Captain Bukharin touched my shoulder. I'm going to the 4th Company, Alexander Terentyevich. It's the first to go on the attack. Good. Go on. So the barrage of bursts somehow stopped at once. In the ensuing calm, even a firefight in the rear of the Utii was heard, but it lasted for seconds, no more than that. The telephone rang, rockets burst over our heads. Siesta telephone wires came the call. Forward to the attack, which was followed by the call that rang through the It was seen how friendly the soldiers stood up and rushed towards the enemy. They ran without ducking at full height with rifles, automatic rifles, and hand machine guns. The neighborhood was filled with the painfully familiar cry of hurrah, which soon turned into a rolling AAAOAA. But here and there enemy machine guns began to come to life. Short lines of machine gun bursts could be heard, with howling and rumbling volleys of enemy artillery fell on the fighting order of companies. In the air heard the cutting voice of fascist 6-barrel mortars, so not all managed to suppress, burned the consciousness of the thought. But there was no time to ponder. The 4th Company broke into the first trench of the enemy, reported Captain Bukharin. The specially distinguished platoon Senior Lieutenant Odegov. Not you for the good news, Nikolai Yakovlevich. Almost immediately received reports from Kovalev and the commander of the 6th Company, Senior Lieutenant Chugunov, Nikolai Pavlovich Chugunov, EA, a man of desperate courage. Reported. Lay down under crossfire of rifle and machine gun. This worried me. Since an experienced officer asks for help, it means that it's hard. I sent him machine gun and mortar platoons from my reserve. Meanwhile, the battle was heating up. It is difficult to tell about all the combat deeds of comrades. The first to break into Utii was the squad of Sergeant Vasily Bogomaz. The junior commander, in a difficult situation, managed to ensure the advance of the platoon by fire of the squad. Komsomolets Junior Sergeant Fyodor Like, replacing the out-of-service commander, went with the platoon to the flank of the enemy and blocked the way of Hitlerites' retreat in the direction of the 5th Company's offensive. Private Mersely Rakimov, by fire of the squad, provided advancement of the right flank of the 6th Company. It is impossible not to say a kind word about Privates Nikolai Andriushko, Ivan Klusenko, Ivan Manko, Konstantin Shpirin, Junior Sergeants Alexei Vereshchuk, Anton Zigora, Joseph Ostrinsky, Sergeant Semyon Polyakov, Ivan Yunishev, and many other fighters of the battalion who were honored with government awards for this battle. The battle, having gained strength, rumbled like a mountain collapse along the entire perimeter of the settlement. In the sky, continuously buzzing airplanes. Groups of Junkers struck at the rear of the division, the positions of neighbors. Messerschmitts, sneaking up to the fighting positions of artillery, bombarded them with machine gun fire and escaped as soon as our fighters appeared. At times in the air-tied carousels of air battles, it was difficult to determine at once on whose side the preponderance. But more often, under the friendly cries of the NP communicators, airplanes with the spider swastika fell. The encirclement ring was getting tighter and tighter. Nevertheless, the Nazis continued to resist. Company commanders reporting on the advance noted that, even seeing the hopelessness of their situation, they did not give up. They went mad, reported Captain Bukharin, who had returned to the base. Senior Lieutenant Odegov surrounded a group of Hitlerites in one of the courtyards, offered to surrender, but they started shooting back. We had to throw grenades. Fanatics, that's all. One of the last mobilization, 50 years old. I don't understand anything. What is there to understand, Nikolai Yakovlevich? They're scared, afraid. Not only on the battalion offensive area so desperately fought the Germans. Major Rumyantsev, head of the operations department, called me, asked about the cases. Pyotr Vasilievich. Everywhere the Krots persist. At Krasovsky, Lieutenant Mokut broke into the village before yours, but so far there is no progress. Continue, my godson, to press must not withstand the nerves of the fascists. Meter by meter the companies were approaching the center of the village. Especially distinguished machine gunners, Senior Lieutenant Fyodor Lukyanenko. Having moved forward, they literally did not let Hitlerites raise their heads. Mortars of Lieutenant Vasily Ponomarev helped the rifle companies well. In the midst of the battle, Lieutenant Rubin, the commander of the medical platoon, came running. Usually calm, this time Ivan Dmitrievich was excited. And then, Comrade Captain, the wounded refused to go to the rear. What to do? Now, they refuse. Yelegin was surprised. Yes, they say to the orderlies, after Utii will get better. Yelegin laugh. Ivan Dmitrievich, it's not such a big violation. People are not from the battlefield and go into battle. We'll sort it out later. Rubin did not leave. He was waiting for my answer. The deputy commander said it clearly, Ivan Dmitrievich. There's no time for that now. We need to take Utii. The medic stomped in place, sighed heavily, and hurried off on his own. The battle for the capture of the village of Utii continued. Time had taken away many of its details. Even impassive archival documents could not restore its full picture. Without a continuous encirclement of this Ukrainian village, like a castle, tightly locking the exit to the River Turia, the line of Prince Eugene would have been much more expensive for us. By 14 o'clock, the enemy's resistance began to weaken. Batteries of the Fighter Anti-Tank Division came up and shot the enemy's firing points at point-blank range. After another half an hour, Utii fell. The residents began to appear from cellars, vegetable gardens, bushes. Women, old men, children were crying with joy, hugging fighters and commanders. I was called to the outskirts of the village by the regiment commander and ordered, bypassing the enemy, to reach the River Turia and seize a bridgehead on its western bank. Every minute is precious, Captain. Otherwise the enemy will come to his senses. It will be much more difficult. I'm assigning you regimental artillery and mortar batteries. We'll have to force it with improvised means. Valentin Evstafievich shook my hand in farewell. I wish you every success. Commanders and fighters convey my thanks for the decisive actions at the capture of Utii. Distinguished present them for awards. Further events unfolded as follows. Pursuing the retreating enemy, the battalion approached the river. Under the fire of the Nazis, companies began to prepare for forcing. Logs, boards, fences and wattles were used. Riflemen, under the guidance of sappers, knitted rafts, tied dried wood in piles. Artillerymen and mortarmen, having taken firing positions, were firing at the reconnaissance targets of the enemy. On our right, the head detachment of the 828th Rifle Regiment of Lieutenant Colonel Krasovsky was preparing to rush across the water barrier. There, the firing subsided and then flared up again. To the rifle and machine gun fire were soon added mortar volleys of Hitlerite. Then came the aviation. German planes began to drop bombs on the fighting orders of the Krasovets. The guys are hot. I heard a familiar bass behind me. I looked back. Well, yes, he, a former colleague in the operational department of the division, Captain Gerasimov. Petya, what are you doing here? Now fate is in the hands of our superiors. They sent me to you to hurry up with the forcing. We seem to be working in one breath as it is. I see, Sasha, I see. Having familiarized himself with the situation, Gerasimov advised to move machine gun and mortar companies to the water's edge, a platoon of 40-footers to transfer with the first echelon. The regimental reinforcements should be transferred with the approach there as well. With artillery, Sasha, you feel better. His suggestions made sense. That's what I did. This meeting with Captain Gerasimov was my last. Soon Pyotr Sergeyevich left for his studies. In my memory, he remained a brave, disciplined officer. The company of Senior Lieutenant Kovalev was the first to reach the opposite shore. The officer, having oriented himself in the situation with the cry for the motherland, forward, led the men in the attack for the expansion of the bridgehead. Simultaneously with us, forced the river and neighbours. At first, the companies of brothers Alexander and Ivan Likov clung to the opposite bank. Senior lieutenants established interaction with Kovalev, covered the junction and the flank of the bridgehead with fire. In the future, I had to meet with them more than once. Especially liked the quick as Mercury Alexander. The enemy tried to throw us off the captured scrap, but he failed to do this despite the fact that to the place of the breakthrough the fascists brought reinforcements, continued to hold the crossing under artillery and mortar fire, and in the sky continuously hovered their aviation. The battle lasted for 2 days and was extremely fierce. We lost count of the enemy counterattacks. One wave of fascists followed another. Several times Hitlerites managed to even reach the water, but every time they were forced to retreat under the crossfire of our artillery and machine guns. Meanwhile, the front troops continued to push the enemy. Headquarters demanded from us decisive actions in the direction to Vladimir Volinsky. In a few hours, the battalion was visited by corps and division commanders, not to mention the regimental. The telephone was crackling incessantly. Everyone was interested in success. But only at night on July 17, we, in cooperation with neighbours, managed to overturn the enemy and began to pursue him. On the way, the regiment stormed Kogilno, a number of other settlements. As we approached Vladimir Volinsky, resistance of the enemy increased. Attempts of the division's units to break through the enemy's defence on the move were not successful. The division commander ordered to regroup the forces. Our regiment surrendered the battle area to the right flank battalion of the 862nd Infantry Regiment and took a new line for the offensive. The enemy created around Vladimir Volinsky deeply echeloned defence. 7 times we went up in attack, until we captured the first trench, but further the barrage of fascist fire did not allow us to advance. It was hot and I was thirsty. I took a sip of water from my flask and asked the communicator to connect me with the regiment commander. I picked up the phone. I hear the general, a representative of the higher headquarters, scolds the commander of the 1st Battalion for the fact that the battalion is not moving forward. Now, I think, Wilby and me. Indeed, about 5 minutes later the telephone sounded. Barely had time to bring the receiver to his ear. Why don't you want to go forward? We are continuously attacking, Comrade General, I answered. But the enemy has created a strong defence. We need artillery. I order you to attack the enemy through Podlers. Yes, he replied. I throw the last reserve a platoon of scouts. Dashing guys will try to do everything. And suddenly a call from the Chief of Staff, Major Modin. We won't attack. We'll attack at night. What about the order of the representative of the higher headquarters? Sir General cancelled the order. He was convinced that it's impossible to attack during the day, and he himself came under heavy mortar fire. Night came. The cannonade of battle did not cease. Especially intense firing came from the right flank, where the 828th Rifle Regiment was advancing. The neighbours on the left were somewhat quieter, only about 2 o'clock on the direction of the offensive of the 862nd Regiment of Major Kovzevnikov. In the rear of the enemy, a firefight broke out. Rockets lit up the sky. It turned out that the battalion of Captain Gennady Makurin on the dried swamp came to the eastern outskirts of Vladimir Volinsky. There followed a command to intensify the fire impact on the enemy. An hour and a half later, company commanders reported on the withdrawal of the Germans. I reported to the regiment commander. "Do not break away from the enemy," followed the order of Major Pavliuk, to impose his will to knock down his outposts from the intermediate lines. We began the pursuit. By the flashes of gunfire, rockets taking off, it was not hard to guess that the neighbours went forward. At dawn, Vladimir Volinsky passed into our hands. On the outskirts of the city, and in the centre, there was no particularly brutal fight. Apparently, the will of the enemy was paralysed by the actions of our troops on the approaches to this industrial centre, a major hub of railroads and highways. In the order of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, for the liberation of Vladimir Volinsky, we were commended. On the same day, the front troops took the town of Ravaruskaya. Moscow, in honour of these victories, saluted from 224 guns. Ahead was the Western Bug, the border with Poland. On the marches and on the halts, in the trenches, in the short lull between battles, sleepless nights at the front, we dreamed of the day when we would throw out the fascist scum from our land. We swore it to our comrades who had fallen in battle, and that day came. A joyful, long-awaited day. Never forget the happy smiles of soldiers, sergeants, officers. I remember how Lieutenant Maligan, the battalion commander, came up to me on the march and shouting especially noticeably, "The guys can't wait to go to the border." Kilometers 20 swept today, and with reluctance met the last break. I was in Kovalev's company. No sooner had we smoked a twist than the soldiers themselves began to rise, saying, "We'll finish it afterwards at the border, and at the same time we'll take a drink of water from the Western Bug." That's what they are, Commander. I know, Vasily Fedorovich. I'd like to see the Western Bug sooner myself, my dear party secretary. Beating the enemy resistance, the division continued to advance. Forward detachments of the 828th and 862nd Regiments, accompanied by batteries of the 418th Separate Fighter Anti-Tank Division of Major Vasily Nikolaevich Gorshkov, now and then came into contact with the enemy. Short but fierce firefights broke out. The fascists usually could not withstand our onslaught, retreated to another favourable line, leaving behind them solid minefields. Then it was the turn of sappers of Major Konstantin Sergeyevich Lapshin. Tailors of war had to work hard all the way. Their hands were used to build bridges, to make passages in minefields, to build engineering structures. The sappers did their best. It is necessary to give credit. They successfully coped with difficult and very dangerous work. In the morning of July 21, the advanced detachment of the 862nd Rifle Regiment of Major Kozhivnikov came to the Western Bug. The commander, without wasting time, began to force it. On improvised means, units began the crossing. The first to the opposite bank landed on the company of Lieutenant Sergei Zidorin. Not expecting neighbours, the officer managed to expand the captured area. Decisive actions ensured the crossing of the detachment. Almost simultaneously with the 862nd, began to force the river 828th Rifle Regiment of Lieutenant Colonel Nikolai Viktorovich Krasovsky. The news of the forcing of the Western Bug reached us with lightning speed. The battalion accelerated its pace, and when the river was a few kilometers away, voices were heard ahead. Carried, soon a horseman appeared. The scout sergeant held a helmet in his hands, passing company columns, shouted, "Water from the Western Bug. Guys, the border is near." In response, there was a loud soldiers' hurrah, caps flew up, cheers were heard, soldiers embraced each other. In half an hour, the mirror of the river shone in front of us. The eastern shore was buzzing like an awakened beehive. Riflemen, machine gunners, and mortarmen hurried to the water, dragging with them everything that could keep them on the surface of the water. The anti-tankers were making rafts for the guns out of improvised materials. Not far away, the batteries of the artillery regiment were firing on the western bank of the river. The river was also crowded. On boats, rafts, logs, planks, bags stuffed with dry hay. The soldiers crossed to the opposite bank. The water was bubbling, foaming, rising up in storms from explosions. But the aimless fire did not do much harm. It is understandable. The battle was 3 kilometers ahead, and here was already the rear. The battalion had set foot on the territory of brotherly Poland.